it's Alex from Black Sheep IT Consulting. It has been a while that I made a video on the migration application. Now, the migration application is a great utility, and with so many projects having already upgraded successfully to the post IP17 architecture, the modern day Siebel architecture. So whether you have Siebel 17, which you really shouldn't have, or 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, you have to use the migration application to move your stuff from development, DR, design repository, to the test, QA, integration test, and of course, production runtime repository or RR environment. Now, I presume you know all that. If not, check out the links in the descriptions for more training on the migration application. So to get to grips, and there's also a free playlist, which this video is part of. And in this video, I'm going to take on an article I wrote like 2 years ago on how to create a custom migration service. Now, let that sink in. Custom migration service. That means, in addition to the 8 or so standard business services that Oracle delivers into our repositories, they all start with migration, and that's important. We will talk about that later. So these are all the standard services that you see pop up in the migration application. You can pick and choose. So what I'm saying is this list of resources for migration under metadata and files is actually a list of business services that the migration application calls via the Siebel inbound REST API for business services. And the outcome of this video will be another service in this list, which you can pick and choose and use as part of your deployment strategy. So the article is quite detailed, and you find the link in the description. So you will learn about 2 files, resource sequence.txt and orchestration.json, which need to be modified. And of course, you have to create a business service. But it's not any old business service in eScript that you can create, or you could possibly, but it has to have something to do with migration, more or less. Otherwise, you wouldn't put it in the migration application. So what we are doing is copy an existing business service, an existing migration business service, and create a custom service. And the article uses a approach to create a custom business service, and it's quite interesting that I came up with this idea to run a server manager as part of the migration application. So I thought this was a great idea. But recently I came across a requirement which is more, let's say, realistic. So I will not follow the path here. I will divert from this path. I will not create a migration service that can call server manager. If you really want to know how to do that, you're welcome. You can follow the instructions in the article, of course. And I will have to modify these 2 text files so that the service actually is part of the migration application then. And I will have to register the business service with at least one responsibility in the business service access list, since the Siebel migration application uses Siebel REST. So the user logged into the migration application must have access to that business service, like with any other REST business service that you want to invoke via REST. And here's the outcome of this article. So you have a new service popping up in your list in the migration application. So you can create a migration plan and run it, and hopefully successful. And yeah, that's the end of the article. So let's see it live in the environment that I have. So currently there's no custom migration resource listed here. I have, however, to speed this up a little bit, I've been busy in Siebel tools, and you can see here the list of migration services. So the scenario that we'll use is actually you want to do the same thing that the migration application data service does. You want to be able to export and import data from arbitrary tables, like system preferences, for example, or any other table. But you want to extend the functionality so you can have a pre-delete clause. And my new business service that I copied, so it's a copy of the migration application data service. So it has the same class, that's important. And it's named migration, has to start with migration, application data service with pre-delete. So the first word in the name, the first token must be migration. That's very important. So that's an exact copy at first, and I modified the copy. So I did not change any of the methods. So my new service inherits through the copy the import, export, and get status methods. And those migration business services, they are very special. I have a special class, as you can see, so that's driven by user properties. So here's the list of business service user properties. So let's see the standard vanilla service first. You could modify it. Oracle is like okay with that if you modify a standard service, but you have to be very careful and follow the instructions on Oracle support. So I went with a copy. I have my own custom service, so I do not interfere with the vanilla service. The vanilla service, or any of these migration services, have for each method, like export, they have an executable. And this is data.exp. So data.exp is a undocumented command line utility, and you're not supposed to run it manually or from any script. So that's a no-no for Oracle support. But here, of course, the business service concatenates the command line that will then run on the server. So you call a business service, but the command line will be executed. If you're curious, and you might be the first time that you see this, check out the other standard migration services like the, incremental runtime repository data service, and you will not be surprised that the export executable is repimexp. And of course, followed by a bunch of parameters which get their values either from hard-coded values or variables that are passed at runtime. So back to my migration application data service. So we learn it uses data.exp with a bunch of parameters like an input file, which it reads, and you don't have to write that file manually. You can generate it from the special migration rule view. So take a look at that. And there's other videos that I made using that service. On import, however, you see that it doesn't specify the I parameter, so it literally reads no input file. Now, if you want to have a pre-delete where clause, so let's quickly go to command line, and I'm in the Siebel server binary directory. So let's type data.imp. Let's just run it without arguments, and that lists all the arguments we have. So the obvious username, password, and so forth. So here's the input file /i, and there's also /w right above it. Enter pre-delete where clauses, defaults to n. Now if I set this to yes and provide an input file with a where table name and where clause, it will delete records matching that where clause in that table. So that's what we want to do. We want to clean up some records before we import new versions of those records or whatever. So that's the goal. Now, if you look at the standard implementation of the migration application data service, which uses data.imp, it doesn't read an input file, and the W parameter is set to no explicitly, despite even being the default no. It says definitely no where clause. And you might have already guessed what my changes are. So if I go to the custom copy, I added a parameter for the import executable, for the I parameter, and I made up a file name, dataimp.imp. You can give this any name. You will have to create and cater for that file manually, unless you come up with a really clever solution to generate it, but that's not the goal of this video. So this is a new business service user property I added, and I modified the W parameter to yes. So read this file to know the where clause to delete records. So that's my new service. I tested it, I delivered it, and then I have to take care of these two files. So you have to go to the machine where your migration application is deployed. Then in application container external, you will find web apps. There's the Siebel web app folder. Go in there, and there's webinf. And there we have it. I have already made copies here, so you will find an orchestration JSON file and a resource sequence text file. You need to edit both files. So it's probably a good idea to not mess with the standard file. Let's call this backup for now. And here I already have a file prepared, or let's rename this file to orchestration JSON. So that's a edited version. And also here the custom version of resource sequence.txt I renamed to the original name. So resource sequence.txt is the easy part. You open it in editor of your choice, and that's the whole file. So it's a text file and basically says, do not modify the sequence of existing business services, but if you want to add a new migration service, then enter the service name, and for each method list is its source or target, watermark, blah, blah, blah. So that's a little bit confusing, but you have plenty of samples like the migration application data service, which we have just copied in the repository. It has an entry here. So what I did is copy this line, and at the end of the list, it says don't change the sequence, right? So at the end of the list, I pasted it. I pasted again now, so you see what I changed. All I changed was literally the name of the service. So my name is with pre-delete, right? So that's the whole name of the business, the real business service name. Okay, let's get rid of that line again. So that's how you create these lines. You probably always copy an existing service, so it's easy to copy the line. Don't worry too much about these other parameters. It's important, of course, to understand that, well, there's the name of the get status method, and so if you mess with those method names, then of course you have to implement your own. And the reason why migration must be the first part of that name, it pops up here. There's a search spec down there. So when it kind of reads the list of services that it's supposed to use, there's a search spec like migration asterisk. So it will only consider services that begin with migration. So now we know why we have to start the name, begin the name with migration. Okay, so that's my change. One line here in the resource sequence.txt file. And of course, I save the change, close the file. Let's close this one too. And then there's orchestration JSON. Now this is a little bit trickier because, well, it's a JSON file. And we are copying a service. So basically what you do is find the service you are copying, migration application data service. And here's a resource name. So there's a list of resources. You see a resource name pops up quite a lot. So there's a bunch of resources in a list, and that's within the import section. So list of resources for import. So my service should support import for sure, because that's where the pre-delete happens, but it also should support export. So there is an import section. Have we collapsed that? Well, there's an export section as well. And the service, if it needs to be usable for both import and export, it has to be listed in both sections as a resource. So let's find the resource for the original service. So you would basically copy the entire section here. And well, I choose the place after the migration data service with transformation. I paste it in the section here carefully with the commas and brackets, and of course make sure that you change the name of the resource name, business service, and async business service. So wherever the business service name appears, make sure it has your custom name. So that's number one in the import section. And as you can imagine, I did that in the export section too. So here's the resource for export with 3 instances, three times my custom business service name. Be careful, validate the JSON, because if you get something, if you get anything wrong, with commas and double quotes and brackets and whatnot, you get in trouble. Okay, so save these changes. And final step before we can restart, I'll go to this business service access view. And here in the business service access view, you have to deliver it first and then log in again. Let's see what migration services are listed here. So the standard services are of course listed here already for Siebel Administrator, and you might want to add other responsibilities or remove Siebel Administrator because you have a different. It doesn't matter for the test, so we use sadmin. And here I added a record for my new custom business service. I use Siebel Administrator for the test responsibility, and don't forget to expose the methods. So it has 3 methods. I expose all of them, so the migration application can make this inbound REST call to the service with the user that is logged into the migration application. We will restart the environment anyway, but if you don't, make sure you clear the cache, so the EI object manager has to pick it up. So we have the changes in place. I've already restarted my environment. So I will now, because I renamed the files for demonstration purposes, when you modify those 2 files, resource sequence and orchestration JSON, all you need to do is literally bounce the Tomcat that hosts a migration application. So the external Tomcat I'm restarting right now. Okay. So it's restarted. Let's log into the migration application fresh. We're sure we get a fresh session there. And here we go. So still not visible. You might be frustrated here, but it's now time to hit that refresh button for your connection. So that's when it, well, reads the list of migration services. So let's reload the DR. Yes. And there it is. Application data service with pre-delete. So missing the migration part, the first word, so it strips that off. That's good. The QA is a fake here, so it's the same environment, but so I refresh that as well, and it rereads the information. And of course, we have a new application data service with pre-delete now. Very nice. So now let's test that thing. So for testing, I'll go to system preferences. So that's my test ground. System preferences, of course, we all know what it is. And I already created two system preferences, Alex test 1, Alex test 2. So don't try this with standard system preferences. You mess up your system, create custom ones, or use any other table you like. And these two I want to export. And then I will make sure I can test the deletion as well. So I've got DevPops installed. Look up DevPops on the Siebel Hub YouTube channel. You'll see a lot of descriptions there. It's a free open source utility. So I will use it to show the table and column names. So here I have sys, syspref, syspref cd. So I need to make sure I can export those. And that will do in the migration rule view in the administration application screen. So I created a record there already. And this is similar to what you've seen in other videos, maybe. You have to add the table and a condition, optionally, of course, but you don't want to export everything. So you notice that I use syspref cd like Alex%. So you have to type it in real SQL. Not Siebel query language, but database SQL. And make sure the select checkbox is selected. And I still can't get over myself with that export button. It does not export anything. Even if it says it export completed successfully. Yes, dream on. What it did is actually when you hit that button, it creates a file, an input file in the INP input folder in your migration file system directory of that enterprise. So here we have the data. It actually creates that file, datamig.inp. What's in that file? We're a bit nosy here. Well, it says syspref where syspref cd like Alex. So that's exactly what I entered. You could say now, well, I can type this in manually, and yes, you can, but let's follow protocol. There is a view where you can do this, and it creates that file for you, which is just nice. Now that's used for exporting. Let's take a look at the business service. Let's go back. For exporting, it uses the datamig.inp. For import, my new custom user property uses dataimp.inp. So that file I cannot generate through a standard view. So what I did is basically copy the file and rename it, because it currently has the exact where clause that I want. From syspref, delete records which match that where clause. And if you do your tests against syspref on your own, please make sure you don't delete any standard records. Yeah, just make sure those test records are deleted. Now this will be the input file for the import, and it will be used, the where clause will be used to delete the records. And the datamig.inp will be used for exporting only those records. Okay. So we have the two files. Let's go back to the migration application. we have records in system preferences. So let's go to system preferences back. Let's check those records. Okay, test, Alex test 1, test 2. Now in the migration application, I'm going to create a migration plan. A asynchronous. We do asynchronous. DR. Export from the DR, and we can pick. Now that's really satisfying. We can choose our service here, and that's export sys pref, and that's export test. Okay, that's our export plan. Now let's execute the plan. So let's hit the action button. Yes. And it will save it as a zip file in the shared migration folder or the migration folder itself. So let's say syspref test zip. Okay, will not take long. So let's expand this. It's running the export already. Let's see the log file. Okay, it runs data exp. There's the data, reads the data make input file, does some other stuff, and it exported 2 rows. Perfect. And it should be in a zip file right now. So let's, check history. Yeah, definitely successful. So now that file, or the .dat file within that file, has the 2 records. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to rename those test records to 3 and 4. Records 1 and 2 are in the file. Now, if I would import it without pre-deletion, I would have 4 records or an update on these records, or anyway. I want to make sure these records are deleted. So let's create a 3rd one. Alex test 5. Okay, so we have 3 records. All right, so now that was basically standard. The export function we didn't touch. So now let's create a migration plan for import. Import syspref with pre-delete and test import. Now the Q&A will be the target. We pick the pre-delete application data service and save it. Okay, so we have an import plan. Okay, let's see the zip file. So we have the syspref test zip. That was our file. Okay, so you must have the zip file from a previous run, and make sure that in the INP folder you have your input file, which you need to create manually with the name you choose. So now let's run the import plan. There's the file name. Okay. Let's see. It's running, so you should get a log file. And the big question is, does it read the input file? Yes, it reads the input file, data make IMP. And the W parameter is yes. It has deleted 3 rows. And it imported 2 rows. And I think that's successful. That's verified. So here's my previous state. Let's just rerun that query. And there's records 1 and 2 from the import. So 3, 4, and 5 are gone. And there you have it. A custom migration business service doing the stuff you want in a standardized way. Now it's now part of your migration plan. Thanks for watching. Take care and bye-bye.